Chapter 18. The Breakdown of the International System. 1. The Impact of World War I on Global Gold Parity. In the summer of 1914, the Golden Age did not fade away. It was executed. For decades, the international gold standard had functioned like a vast, silent clockwork, ensuring that a merchant in Hamburg could trade with a clerk in Liverpool as if they shared the same wallet. But as the guns of August began to thunder across the European continent, the delicate gears of this clockwork were instantly shattered. To fight a total war, nations needed more than just courage. They needed an unlimited supply of money. Money that the rigid physical limits of the gold standard simply could not provide. Almost overnight, the great powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, suspended gold convertibility. They slammed shut their golden windows, effectively telling their citizens that the paper notes in their pockets could no longer be exchanged for the metal they ostensibly represented. This was a desperate act of economic martial law. By disconnecting their currencies from gold, governments gained the power to print massive quantities of paper fiat money to pay for shells, tanks, and millions of soldiers. This was the moment the yardstick was replaced by the printing press. The result was a total loss of global parity. Without gold to act as the universal stabilizer, the exchange rates between nations began to drift and collide like icebergs in a storm. Inflation, once a distant memory, became a predatory reality. The British pound, once the undisputed king of the world, began to bleed value, while the American dollar, protected by a massive gold reserve, remained the last standing pillar of the old order. The war proved that while gold was the perfect peacetime money, it was a shackle during war, and the decision to break that shackle would haunt the global economy for decades to come. 2. The stabilization efforts of the 1920s. When the smoke finally cleared in 1918, the world was a monetary graveyard. The German mark was headed toward a hyperinflationary death spiral, and the British Empire was drowning in debt to the United States. Throughout the 1920s, a frantic, high-stakes effort was made to restore the Temple of Gold. Central bankers, led by the enigmatic Montague Norman of the Bank of England and Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve, believed that returning to the gold standard was the only way to prevent global revolution and restore Victorian stability. The centerpiece of this effort was Britain's return to gold in 1925 at the pre-war parity, the old rate of $4.86 per pound. This was an act of immense national pride, but catastrophic economic logic. The British economy had been hollowed out by the war, yet its leaders insisted on valuing the pound as if the British Empire were still at its 19th century peak. This made British exports too expensive and plunged the nation into industrial strikes and unemployment. The 1920s were a ghost dance, an attempt to revive a dead system using the gold exchange standard. Nations began to count their paper holdings of dollars and pounds as if they were actual gold reserves. This created a highly leveraged and fragile global architecture. It was a house of cards built on a thinning layer of bullion. While the world appeared to have returned to the golden stability of the past, the underlying foundation was cracked, and the stage was set for a collapse that would dwarf the trauma of the Great War. The global crisis of 1929 and the flight from gold. The Great Depression did not merely damage the gold standard, it exposed the system's original sin: the inability of a rigid geological asset to expand alongside the desperate needs of a collapsing human society. By 1929, the world's financial architecture was a palace of glass built upon a foundation of shifting sand. When the New York stock market collapsed in October, the initial shockwave felt like a domestic affair, but it soon triggered a global death rattle of credit. As banks across Central Europe began to fold like dry parchment, most notably the Austrian Creditanstalt in 1931, a primal, atavistic terror gripped the international markets. This was the flight from paper. In the gilded counting houses of London and the marble halls of the Federal Reserve, the realization dawned. There was not enough gold in the world to satisfy the sudden, panicked hunger for it. Nations that had spent a decade trying to act civilized under the gold exchange standard suddenly reverted to a predatory survival instinct. This period was characterized by a destructive paradox. To keep their gold from fleeing, nations were forced to raise interest rates to punishing levels. Imagine a man suffocating in a room. The gold standard was the heavy iron door that refused to open, insisting that the air, credit, be restricted even as the patient's face turned blue. By late 1931, the pressure was so immense that the British pound, the very sun of the monetary universe, literally snapped. When the Bank of England finally threw in the sponge and suspended gold payments, it was not just a policy change, it was the end of an epoch. The invariable yardstick had become a whip, and the world's nations, one by one, decided they would rather be heretics than corpses. 4. The 1934 Gold Reserve Act, a new era in American finance. In America, the crisis reached its crescendo in the winter of 1933. The yellow metal that had once symbolized freedom and prosperity had become a weapon of hoarding. President Franklin Roosevelt, a man of action who viewed the gold standard as an outdated fetish, decided to perform a radical surgery on the American dollar. Following his inauguration, he declared a national bank holiday and launched a psychological war against the money changers. The culmination of this war was the Gold Reserve Act of January 30th, 1934. This law was the funeral service for the classical American gold standard. With the stroke of a pen, the U.S. government became the sole owner of every grain of gold in the country. It was the most massive transfer of wealth in history. The citizens' right to hard money was replaced by a soft promise from the state. Then Roosevelt performed an act of legislative alchemy. He raised the price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. This move effectively devalued the dollar by 41%, making American debts easier to pay, but fundamentally altering the contract of money. The gold was moved into the newly built subterranean fortresses like Fort Knox, where it would sit as a ghost asset, no longer used to settle a citizen's trade, but to serve as a strategic pawn in the looming game of global geopolitics. Gold had been nationalized, turned from the people's shield into the government's sword. 5. Nationalistic managed standards versus international parity. By the mid-1930s, the one world, one gold ideal of the 19th century had dissolved into a cacophony of monetary tribalism. The international landscape was now a battlefield of competing currency blocks. On one side stood the gold bloc, France, Italy, and the Benelux nations, which clung to the orthodoxies of the past with a religious fervor, suffering through brutal deflation just to keep their gold parities. On the other side was the sterling area and the dollar zone, where currencies were managed by government bureaucrats to favor domestic industry over international stability. This transition marked the birth of totalitarian finance. Money was no longer a yardstick that sat outside the reach of the king. It was now a tool of the state. Governments began to use exchange equalization accounts, secret slush funds, to manipulate the value of their currencies, engaging in competitive devaluation to steal trade from their neighbors. This was the end of parity. The idea that a dollar in New York and a franc in Paris represented the same physical weight of the Earth's crust had vanished. In its place was a world of floating phantoms, where the value of a man's labor depended on the secret decisions of a central bank committee. The gold standard had provided a century of internationalism. Its breakdown provided the economic nationalism that would eventually fuel the engines of the Second World War. The light of the Golden Age had been extinguished. replaced by the flickering, uncertain shadows of the managed age.